Good morning, or good afternoon, or good night, wherever you are. My name's Simon Rubens from the Energy Conference Network, and welcome to our webinar today, which is going to focus on business resumption in the global pandemic environment. This is a webinar we're doing in conjunction with the University of Houston College of Technology and BTI Institute, which is the Border Trade and Immigration Institute, which is a Department of Homeland Security Centre of Excellence. So thank you very much for joining us. Firstly, let me apologise for last week. We were meant to run this webinar last week and we had some issues with our platform. So we really appreciate those of you that did try and attend last week and came back for a second try this week. So thank you for your patience, and a big thank you to our panellists for coming back in the second week as well. We have four fantastic panelists, so I'm going to introduce our moderator in a moment. But before I do, just a couple of notes. The webinar will be recorded, or is being recorded, and will be made available to everybody after either later on today or tomorrow. You'll get an email with the recording details, so no need to take a lot of notes or take screenshots, anything like that. You'll have access to it. Also, there's a Q&A button you'll see down the bottom of your screen. So at any time, if you want to ask questions, feel free to type it in there, and the panelists will address the questions at the end. So we want to make this as interactive as possible. So please use that function. So how the webinar is going to proceed today is, in a moment I'll introduce Maria Burns, Professor Maria Burns, and she will be leading the discussion through 6 key areas being listed on your screen there: the current state or status of the market demand, specific market segments, market trends, the human factor, and a new skill set. So Maria will lead those discussions with the panelists, and then we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. So we'll get stuck straight into it. So Professor Maria Burns is a National Academy Scholar. She's a Director of Logistics and Transportation Policy Program at the University of Houston, and an honorary member of the US Coast Guard Auxiliary. She parlays over 20 years experience in the maritime leadership positions, and since 2014, she serves as the Director of the Logistics and Transportation Policy Program and Supply Chain and Logistics Faculty at the College of Technology at the University of Houston. Her research interests include maritime, energy, homeland security, with a focus on policy analysis and data science. So I'm going to hand over to Maria now, and she'll get started on the topics. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you so much, Simon. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this morning or afternoon. This is the pilot Port of the Future webinar titled Business Resumption in a Global Pandemic. I'm delighted to present our dream team. These are amazing maritime professionals with an impressive contribution in the global maritime industry. We know that the world faces much uncertainty leading to a new normal, and our distinguished panelists will share their views on how the maritime industry will look during and after the coronavirus pandemic. They're here to explain what this new normal entails. So let me start with the bios. We start with Mr. Sean Strawbridge, CEO of the Port of Corpus Christi. This is the third largest US port in total revenue tonnage. Sean has over 25 years of experience in the global transportation and energy sectors, holding senior leadership roles in business and corporate development. Large infrastructure development, capital structuring, finance, public-private partnerships are some of his areas of expertise. Sean has been globally recognized for his industry knowledge and large network of professional relationships. Our second panelist, Mr. Thomas Damsgaard, President, LDN Ventures, has 30+ years of experience in global maritime management and executive leadership, including the Clipper Group, Splithoff Group, SAL, Scantrans, and most recently, Inchcape North America. He holds an MBA in Maritime and Logistics from Copenhagen Business School and is an active member of the Houston Maritime community, where he fills leadership roles on several boards. Last but not least, Mr. John Hark, Chartering Director, Bertling Logistics. He serves the Houston maritime logistics industry for 30 years. He works for Bertling Logistics since 2002 and is the Director of Chartering for North America. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Maritime Administration from Texas A&M, where he also works as an adjunct professor for a number of years. In addition, he's the current president of the Houston Maritime Arbitrators Association and serves numerous other organizations. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We are delighted to have you here. And I would like each of our panelists to start with a brief overview of the market. So how is the industry and how your company is actually coping with the pandemic? Let us start with Mr. Sean Strawbridge, sir.
Well, thank you for Professor Burns, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of your participants. You know, we obviously are seeing an international crisis that is epic. It's generational, never before, at least in recent history. I've been in this industry 30 years, and I've never seen such acute demand destruction as we've seen, particularly in the space that the Port of Corpus Christi serves, which is we are primarily an export gateway for U.S. produced energy and energy-related products. The United States is now the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, and has its exports of its energy production, oil, gas, and derivatives of that have been growing for the last decade. And Texas being the largest energy-producing state in the United States, and the Port of Corpus Christi being the closest deep draft port to two of the largest energy producing fields in the United States and in Texas, the Eagle Ford Shale and the Permian and Delaware basins, makes it a natural gateway for the exportation of U.S. energy. And that was really the path that we were on, setting records over the last 5 years up until the novel coronavirus pandemic knocked us off our stride. And so to deal with the demand destruction that we've seen globally, and I'll certainly speak to demand destruction a little later on in your program, Professor, but to deal with it in such a rapid succession, I mean, the rapidity of it has never before been seen, and we've seen market gyrations as a result of that. In fact, crude oil traded at minus $36 at one point briefly, and I'll certainly talk about that as well. But to deal with a crisis of this magnitude and the time in which it happened, the compressed time frame, has really put a strain on American industry, certainly the American economy. We just saw today where GDP contraction was 32%, never before seen. So we're dealing with circumstances that nobody could have fathomed just a few months ago. So then it comes to resiliency, and certainly the Port of Corpus Christi, we do have a fair amount of resiliency, which I'll also talk to. But at the end of the day, we're having to make things up as we go along, including remote, dealing with productivity issues as we're all having to work remotely. So a lot of things to talk about, and certainly the Port of Corpus Christi, the energy sector in particular, and the Texas and the national economy at large have obviously not been unaffected.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir. And Mr. Damsgaard, what are your views about the pandemic and its impact?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Burns. First and foremost, thank you so much for inviting me here today in order to be part of this dialogue of the changing maritime environment. We're seeing a lot of forced change happening for companies in our market. Some are a matter of survival, and some are just a question of adapting to new opportunities. I do want to start out by saying that in these trying times, it's very important to remind ourselves that human lives are at stake here. So our health, our safety and protection of our teams, our clients, our vendors and their families are absolutely priority number one. And most certainly our value sets are being tested in this situation here. London Venture Partners was actually formed to participate in the opportunities reaching beyond the traditional deep sea maritime sphere, where we are focusing on the entire supply chain. Supply chain kind of being the key phrase when we talk about resiliency these days within maritime. We see the pandemic actually as a mandate to come in and start reimagining how our industry will actually look in the future, and allowing us unprecedented level of creativity in coming up with some new solutions. And just to share just a few of the guiding principles that we are seeing develop out of this unprecedented situation, is that we're seeing a shifting focus between competitors, where they're actually starting to focus a lot more on driving better value for customers, and also more concerned about customers' profitability. And through dialogues like we are having today, but also dialogues that we are having across the supply chain, not just our immediate clients, but also a lot deeper in, we're actually able to come up with some really innovative, unique solutions. Then that brings up, of course, our relationships, having these deep, trusting relationships. And that's both internally with our teams that in many cases we haven't seen in 3 or 4 months. Yeah. But also externally across our value chain as well too. And that is a key ingredient in this soup we're in right now, and of how to get out of it. And then like Sean hinted at also, this aspect of staying agile for organizations as well too. Keeping things simple. Complexity is slow and it's expensive. And especially in this situation we're in right now, the COVID does not provide us the luxury of complexity and being slow and expensive. And then finally, this is the time to really go back to where we see our core competencies, where they are, and not chase rainbows. So with that, I'm just really looking forward to engaging in this dialogue with the panel, and also answer questions from the guests this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Damsgaard, and I appreciate your view that something good always comes out of a crisis. So we have to remember that we're learning something, and we're going to, reap these seeds later on. And Mr. John Hark, please.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Good evening. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me on the panel as well. As a company, we've been around since 1865. So like many other old companies, we've been through many world events, 2 world wars, the Spanish flu, of course, that people talk about nowadays, financial crises, oil crises. And so, of course, this is much different than anything that we've faced in the past, but we still lean on those experiences in the past and try to learn going forward with procedures and ways to develop the business in light of these things. So I always say that in logistics, we have a front seat to what's going on in the world, in trade, maritime, domestic trade. We see things that are going on from geopolitics, trade sanctions, and I think we know much quicker than the average layman because it takes a while for these things to make CNBC or CNN or Fox or to be on the news. And, we saw that back in February as the virus was starting to build up steam. I remember sitting with a student of mine who had been at a medical conference on the West Coast, and the discussion was so early. I said, are these doctors taking this thing seriously? I mean, it was back in probably early February. And I remember we just, neither he or I were really sure how bad it was going to get, but he said to me, they're taking it seriously. They think this is an issue. And so as a company, we started thinking about it, and we thought, okay, this is going to affect projects and business outside of just China. It's bound to have some. I remember talking to my students for weeks. It just wasn't showing up really in the news. It wasn't showing up in the stock market or anything. But we started to prepare, because in the project logistics industry, projects are still moving. Of course, we have some that have moved to the right as far as final investment decisions, but going on hiatus in logistics in general is really not an option. And so to provide for our clients, we needed to have plans in place. So we started looking at ways to keep our operation up and running, and basically started working like most on quickly getting going with remote working. And as Thomas was saying, this was a very compressed time period. And as Sean said, we all basically had a couple of weeks. There's some people said, oh, we were thinking about it for weeks, but really from a standpoint of getting going remotely, it was a week, maybe 2 weeks if you were lucky. We got going remotely. And what we found was that it had to be different in different parts of the Bertling world. So specific to the US, we ended up with skeleton staffs in Houston and Miami, where we run warehouses. And I'll talk a little bit more about that further on, but we still are in that mode today. So we're now past 4 months of this skeleton sort of setup in the 2 warehouses and offices. We office at the warehouse. It is running smoothly. So some offices in the Bertling group, and I'm sure with other logistics providers, could go fully remote. But if you're running a warehouse, of course, there's certain considerations, and I think that goes with ports and terminals, of course, as well. So again, we're still working that way in the Bertling group. One of the other things that I did, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, is I talked to my peers in the business, and I continue to talk to my peers in the business. And there's certainly more of an openness now around how are we handling these issues. And I'm sure Sean is talking to his peers and other port authorities around the country and around the world. And I definitely am seeing this idea of collaboration. And so the idea was, okay, what are you doing for your plans in your office, and sharing sort of best practices. And also letting them know, if worst case scenario, you've got something that runs through your office, you know, we could still support each other with moving cargo for each other. And those discussions continue. We know that, of course, with all the precautions that you can take, something is going to happen again, probably that we cannot even imagine right now. But we're optimistic, as Thomas said, that through this crisis, we will be better prepared as we were from previous crises, although nothing like what we're facing now. And so we're confident that as an industry, we are all going to learn from what's going on now and take that forward with future issues, and to make business better just in general going forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harrick, for mentioning about your global group and how you have managed the business at a local level and globally during the pandemic and moving forward. So is there something else that you would like to add before we move on with next questions about demand?
I think what we're going to talk about around managing with the demand is certainly our owners, being a global company, realized that they cannot have a one-size-fits-all, right, for the Bertling group. And I'm sure other international companies are seeing the same thing, whether it's hotspots that flare up, possible government regulations. You know, we see our Singapore office may be out through the fall, and that's mainly due to government authorities in Singapore, right? Because it's a city and fairly tightly packed. So our owners, our shareholders are giving us the freedom to handle the situation locally, which I think is great, but giving sort of that global corporate support and guidelines as well, which are important. And the example I gave are here in the US. Our main operations in the US are Texas and Florida, and more specifically Houston and Miami, which of course Miami is still a hot spot, and Texas was. We're maybe seeing a little bit of a flattening, but as I said, Singapore is going to have some restrictive rules in place. So it's really a balance of taking into account the care of our employees, servicing our clients, and of course looking out for our shareholders and business interest as well. And I think there is a purpose to that order of priorities. And so you take care of the employees and keep them safe. Of course, we can't control what they do outside of work, but we're making the attempt to keep them safe by not bringing them together in a closed environment. We are then able to service our clients by keeping our employees safe. And ultimately, we have a viable business for our shareholders and owners and the staff to continue working at. You can't just tread water. You've got to be and think, okay, we're doing great. You know, look at the last couple of months. We're managing this pretty well. If you're just treading water, as Stanley McChrystal, the retired general, said recently, you've got two options. You're either standing still or you're moving forward. And so you've got to keep moving forward as an industry and as companies within the industry. Those that don't move forward and just sit back and say, we're doing okay with this, they're going to be left behind. And so our focus and from our owners is, yeah, we need to be able to tread water now through this environment that we're in, but we've got to be there with innovative ideas and collaboration and work with our clients and vendors and other partners in the business. So the big thing for us is sort of act globally, as we say, but we are giving the control to the local levels, and that logical order of taking care of your employees, which takes care of the clients, which takes care of the shareholders and owners to keep a viable business going.
Strategy is a big deal. Absolutely. Right. Thank you, sir. Mr. Strawbridge, what is your opinion about market demand during the pandemic? Do you see demand destruction?
Well, certainly, Professor, there's been tremendous demand destruction as a result of the pandemic. In the energy sector alone, you look at people who have had to shelter in place for months and months, and depending upon the sovereignty, depending upon the venue or the country, depending upon the level of acuteness as it relates to the protocols that were employed. The United States was a little more open. There were some countries in Europe and Latin America and China where they had a 100% curfew. You could only go out 2 hours a day, only so many days a week. You could only go for groceries or medical attention. We just, one of the underbelly of democracy here is, in the case of a pandemic, our freedoms and our liberties have actually worked against us. In the case of the energy sector, which is a sector that we primarily focus on, if you look at crude oil alone, demand for crude oil peaked in 2019 at about 103 million barrels per day. That's global demand. We saw that demand fall from that 100 million barrel range in January, February to low 70s, 71, 72 million barrels in April, which we believe was the low water mark for that. And we probably have recovered about 15 million barrels a day. But where are we in terms of our recovery? That's the big question right now is, are we going to see more of an effective containment and retainment scenario as it relates to the coronavirus? Are we going to see a mitigation scenario? Those are two very distinct scenarios. So it's very difficult to plan going forward when we have this dark cloud of uncertainty as it relates to flare-ups, hotspots with the novel coronavirus in different parts of the world. It's very difficult to plan for that. In addition to that, as I said, because we saw such acute demand destruction in such a very short period of time with these protocols, these shelter-in-place protocols, oil and gas production could not slow down accordingly. You cannot just shut off wells from one day to the next. It takes time to ramp them up and to ramp them down. And so what we have created now is an oversupply. Certainly here in the United States, we saw a record supply of crude oil at about 585 million barrels. And it will take some time. And so here again, looking at those different scenarios, how fast we're going to recover, we don't know if it's going to be a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, perhaps an L-shaped recovery, or a W-shaped recovery. And those are very distinct scenarios. All we can do at this point is, as a port, and I know the theme of this webinar is the port of the future. I think to the other speakers' views, to Thomas and to John's point, we have to be creative. We cannot expect that what has worked for us to get us here is going to work for us to get us there. We've got to be looking at other ways, and certainly technological transformations in the port space, which in my opinion, the maritime sector has been a laggard in adopting technologies. This may be actually the catalyst for us to see more increase in technology adoption, whether that's autonomous vessels, whether that's other types of drone technology to help with productivity. Airplanes fly in clouds without visibility. Vessels, if there's fog, they don't move. The technologies are there, but we've got to start to embrace more technological transformations, and we've got to start looking at how we can be more prepared. At the Port of Corpus Christi, preparedness is one of our core values, and our number one asset is not our ship channel, it's not our terminals, it is our people, and Thomas hit the nail on the head with that. Our people are who we have to take care of. We've got to certainly train them. We've got to give them all the tools to be productive going forward in a safe and healthy manner. And so this will really create an opportunity, and that's why you've seen the NASDAQs and technical technology indices reach record levels from an investment standpoint during this global pandemic, because it is recognized that this is an inflection point, certainly an inflection point in the maritime
Best is yet to
industry.
come. Absolutely. Yep. Thank you very much, sir. So, Mr. Damsgaard, how about your perspective on demand? In which ways has the freight demand been disrupted, in your opinion, and how is supply adjusting? In addition, I know that you are working a lot with, the market outlook and, technologies as well. So, what's your perspective about the market outlook and demand?
Thank you for the question. The container demand has, for the first half of this year, has been cut by about 20%. This level of demand destruction, as John was referring to also. And these are the latest numbers from Sea Intelligence that came out here beginning of July. And there's no expected structural rebound for demand heading into the second half of the year, at least for third quarter. So the question is then, how are this drop in demand, how are the carriers responding to it and adjusting to it? And they have used something called blank sailings as a tactical tool here, which stands out a little bit from how they have been responding to it in the past, where it has been kind of a race to zero on freight rates. This time around, using blank sailings, taking out about 10% of the global container fleet, which currently now is sitting idle, had then helped driving a increased demand for freight. And through that, surprisingly, they have actually been able to drive a lot higher freight rates as well too. And if we take a look at just the Pacific trade lanes, you've seen freight rates go from $1,500 to $3,000 in a very short period of time. And there is an expected turn for the container carriers out there that they're actually going to turn a profit in 2020 in spite of all this disruption that has occurred. Now, the big question to me is, how has it been possible for them to get organized this time around across the segment when they historically have been racing to zero to retain zero freight to retain these market shares? And it is the belief that there's this alignment that has happened within the container segment through consolidation and also through some of the strategic alliances has allowed the carriers to be non-destructive in their survival strategy and instead adjusting this structural carrying capacity to match the reduction in demand. I think this could actually serve as somewhat of an inspiration to other market segments as well too, how consolidation and also collaborations could help support stronger freight levels, or at least freight supply levels that would support better freights.
Excellent point. And yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. I think on the supply side also, let's dive into maybe look a little bit of how freight demand is being disrupted and also how supply are changing there as well too. We know that these highly efficient supply chains we've had in the past with in-time, on-demand product deliveries, they have shown their true weakness. We have seen through this pandemic, we've seen cases where inventories are only 8 days tied into the weekly sailing schedule. And when these sailing schedules, then they start sliding out 2 or 3 weeks, or cargo gets bumped because there's not enough carrying capacity. These supply chains are falling or are faulting. And there's examples in Europe. Sweden, I know, is one example where their food supply chain was actually cut down all the way to 8 days, and they actually start to see some severe issues within their whole food supply chain. So now that means that the focus is now on developing more resilient supply chains. And Gartner came out with a survey a few weeks back where they actually went out and interviewed supply chain managers about their plans for the next 2 to 3 years. And more than 30% of supply chain managers are actually seeing a shift from this intercontinental supply chain we've been used to, Far East being a big player in that, and then moving more to regional production. And in our case, in North America, that means moving most likely to either insource it to country, but also to Central America, Mexico being a big player there as well too. And the impact that's going to have on freight, of course, we can't say just yet, but there's no doubt that it's going to definitely have a drop in the demand for global container traffic. And it is going to force the carriers to continue to dial in their capacity in order to try and reach somewhat of an equilibrium so they can continue to have these stronger freight rates.
Excellent points on the containers market. Thank you so much. Sean, how about the crude oil? You and the Port of Corpus Christi are specialized in crude oil. So what's your outlook, your opinion for the crude market? And also, is there increased demand for storage capacity?
Well, storage has certainly been at a premium, given, again, we had this gap between the consumption and production, which created a surplus and has certainly put a damper on pricing. You know, again, the recovery is certainly going to be tied to how quickly we can get the wheels of commerce going again. And the longer that we see, you know, economic destruction as small businesses go out of business, as certain sectors like the energy sector, which has had a significant amount of debt already placed on it before the pandemic, is going to be hard pressed to find additional sources of capital that can fund their recovery. So you're likely going to see more consolidation. Certainly in the upstream space, as we call it, which is the exploration and production space in the U.S., the shale producers are particularly exposed. The majors are always going to be in a good position, but the name of the game is going to be capital discipline, and that's really what we're watching, and that's what we're concerned with. Right now, there are only 250 drilling rigs active in the entire United States. That's the lowest that it has been in decades.
There used to be 1,200 something, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fraction of what it was. And so with the United States really was on pace to be the largest energy producer and still is the largest energy producer, but not the largest energy exporter. And to, you know, the ability to reduce the trade deficit in the United States, which some folks view the trade deficit as a negative. I've been in the trade business a long time, so Thomas and John know the trade deficits aren't necessarily a bad thing because they are adding value to our economy. But, you know, from an energy standpoint, the fact that the United States, which couldn't export its U.S. crude production in 40 years up until December of 2015, so really we're a new player in that space, and we have been taking market share, and it has been at the expense of OPEC. It's been at the expense of Russia. And so really to see, what we need to watch is how much discipline will there be from OPEC plus. There certainly is already demonstrable discipline, production discipline, organic discipline by U.S. producers. But I think for us, our big concern is where are the capital markets, where is the capital going to come from for the recovery in the energy space, given that there was a fairly high degree of leverage already, certainly in the shale production space. So that's certainly something that we're going to be watching going forward.
Interesting points. Thank you, sir. And as a reminder, we're more than halfway through our time and we have so many more questions to go. So I kindly ask all of us to speed up a little bit with the Q&A coming up as well. So Mr. Hark, I'd like to ask you about the impact of diversified supply chains. What's the effect that you think the pandemic will have on sustainability and logistics? And also, do you think that firms will be able to diversify their procurement away from, let's say, foreign suppliers? What's your opinion?
Yeah, I think it is having an effect on sustainability as regards the business continuity aspect of sustainability. Of course, sustainability covers quite a wide range of components that companies need to monitor. There has been a big push for sustainability in general over the last few years. Young people really are paying attention to sustainability with environmental and labor issues. And so in general, this is giving sustainability more attention from a continuity standpoint. Firms had already started to diversify from China with the tariffs that were in place, and the pandemic has now pushed more firms to implement this as well. Of course, diversifying the supply chain will ultimately introduce multiple suppliers as companies do this. And this is going to add complexity in the area of monitoring sustainability ultimately adding cost. And so as with green energy and other initiatives, it's ultimately the consumers if they're going to be willing to pay for this. But it will affect sustainability, and it's going to make it a more complicated process and add to the cost.
Great point. Thank you so much. So what I get from the three of you is that there is certainly, the big question mark about the market uncertainty. Mr. Strawbridge, tell us about the oil market. Do you think that it's likely that we're going to see oil prices hitting $0 as COVID-19 continues?
No, Professor, I think that the likelihood of us hitting zero is going to be fairly low. In fact, what that showed was more, the fact that we went below zero was more the mechanics, the Wall Street mechanics of how futures contracts, crude oil futures contracts transition from one month to the next. But it certainly showed a flaw there that I think the market is certainly going to take corrective action on. But I don't see us experiencing that again.
Thanks for the good news. I'm sure a lot of us will find relief in that. Mr. Hark, tell us about nearshoring. I know you're an expert on that one. So do you think nearshoring really is going to get traction? And how do you think this is going to affect global trade?
Yeah, the pandemic definitely has us thinking about business interruption a lot more closely, whether it's a pandemic, a cyber attack that we've seen recently, political and trade tensions, or natural disasters. And it plays into the subject and the need for nearshoring to secure the supply chain. Think about the issues that came up in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria. We learned, many of us didn't realize that the majority of IV bags were being manufactured for the US on the island of Puerto Rico. And this was disrupted by the hurricane to the point where hospitals were rationing IV bags and changing medical procedures. So, you can also, as I said, look at trade and tariff issues that pop up with political disagreements. Those can come up out of nowhere. We've seen that in the past. I think the Turkey ones that popped up in the last couple of years surprised some people with vessels on the water. And of course, this all depends to some extent on consumers paying more for the products that they want. The new US, Canada, Mexico trade deal certainly will benefit from this idea of nearshoring, and we're seeing that already, and Latin America and Central America, as Thomas said, in general. Of course, I'll also just kind of reiterate what Thomas said. We're always pushing for efficiency. We want our Amazon package the next day. We want toilet paper on the shelves. And what did the pandemic show? There was no cushion at all in the supply chain. And of course, nearshoring, I think, and a lot of people think nearshoring could be something that adds a bit of cushion, but still keeping our efficiencies in the supply chain sort of as tight as possible.
Great points. Thank you. That's exciting. So, Mr. Damsgaard, I know you're an expert in digitalization, and I would like to ask about your opinion. Data analytics, automation, so these are the new trends. And as other speakers also mentioned before, what are your thoughts? What tools have played a role in successfully navigating business during the pandemic? And how do we adapt these new value propositions for the new era?
Thank you. It's kind of interesting how our respective governments that are in charge of the response to the pandemic has a very dubious relationships to facts and data. However, the pandemic has shown how maritime has been able to use data analytics of the entire supply chain to make smarter decisions. And one example is how the container carrier is studying this drop in purchase orders. And again, John was touching on a little bit earlier, trying to reach further out to your clients and understand what is happening on the ground and being a first indicator of where the market is going. And the container carriers following these drops in purchase orders actually allowed them to start adjusting their sailings and also implement these blank sailings I mentioned earlier at a very early stage, actually within 2 weeks of having seen this drop in purchase orders. So it's this kind of data analytics identifying expansion and contraction across the supply chain hierarchy that supports these more agile decisions. And by agile, I mean both decisions in the right area, in the right marketplace, the right trade lanes, but also with the right speed and velocity, the right direction as well too. So like Sean said, we are very conservative in shipping. We have been late adopters to using digital platforms and even using our own data. And it is still in the infancy for shipping. And while we are making decisions now more on a defensive nature, derived basis, these digital data analytics, there is a promise for deep learning, what we call AI, artificial intelligence as well too, to turn our trade intelligence, our market intelligence into wisdom, so we're able to better predict the consequences of our actions going forward, and then eventually end up with some smarter decisions as well too. COVID-19, I'm seeing as an accelerator, and I started out by saying, you know, this is kind of a mandate to start thinking outside the box and being creative. And I think it's probably going to end up for many companies being a critical success factor as well too. So using it as an accelerator, as a mandate to substantially change the way that we do our business. And while I'm talking at it from a carrier standpoint of view, this is across the whole value chain within maritime, and it is very much relevant for the port's competitiveness as well too, as Sean hinted at. You know, optimizing vessels turnaround in ports. There's some really great initiatives out there. The Port of Rotterdam is pushing this port forward, which is actually a green initiative, but that actually also promises to really improve the turnaround and the optimization of the port's capacity. There's the reduction of having human interaction at the attendance of the ship as well too, you know, moving documentation, pre-screening, using AI in order to pre-screen ships and move that into the cloud as well too. And we've seen companies out there like Windward, for instance, that are really pushing that platform as well too. So I'm encouraged both by the big players, whether it's the Maersks of the world or the Inscapes of the world, working with what their historical data is, but also the new entries into the marketplace with startups trying to push these digital platforms.
Great points on automation. So now let's go back to the human factor. Mr. Harrick, tell us about remote and distributed work in maritime and logistics. What are, in your opinion, the challenges and opportunities that companies are facing? And do you think we're going to see more of the global distributed work?
Yeah, I do. I think it is here to stay in some fashion. And every week of continuation of the state that we're in firms up my belief in that even more. You know, we're all hearing anecdotal evidence of companies basically pushing out employees to maybe stay out the rest of the year. We've heard of some making permanent remote working, basically what's going on now, some through next year as well. So it is here. And it's obviously going to change things that are going on in real estate as well as these things become permanent. You know, the first step certainly was getting our staff going at home, and for companies getting them going and monitoring their well-being. Some employees don't like working from home, so you may have to make accommodations for them to possibly be at the office. We did that with our skeleton crews. And of course, it's also related to staying connected with clients and using the technology. And I think we're all getting more used to this technology. We see more clients actually turning their video on when we do a Zoom meeting with them or a Teams meeting. In the beginning, they weren't. We had our cameras on, but the clients didn't. So as far as remote working, I see that continuing. Of course, the industry has been looking at call centers and centers of excellence around the world for years now. What we do know is you've got to monitor the quality and the service closely with those types of initiatives. Some have worked, some have not worked, but that's already sort of an experiment in remote working. If you think about just being away from the headquarters, maybe in a European or a US country, and doing sort of this offshore center in India, for instance, where we've seen it. And sometimes we've seen it in Central America and Latin America. So you've got to keep the client and the vendor needs in mind with these distributed tactical operations like customer service and the people that are trying to even do some tactical logistics execution. The logistics and supply chain industry is, of course, will continue to push for more efficiency, and we're always pushed to be more competitive and to squeeze as much as we can out of the system. What I'd like to say just too, what we've seen, and I've seen some interviews and psychologists and business psychologists and organizational psychologists talking, you know, with the employees, we've got to adjust our expectations for them and ourselves. We've got to adjust to maybe team deliverables in the remote environment. We've got to spend time with our team members to find out how they're handling the circumstances. I think a lot of us are sort of getting now into this fatigue of this environment going on for a long time. And so I think a majority of people start to suffer from COVID fatigue just in general, that the situation's not changing. And those employees need to have tangible support if they're being overwhelmed or feeling overwhelmed. You know, that can turn on from one day to the next. And so it's important that we, you know, keep an eye on the employees. And that sort of goes back to our strategy in most companies: take care of the employees. That takes care of the clients, and ultimately it takes care of the company, right? The company itself, the shareholders and the owners. So bottom line, it's here to stay. But I think we're finding now 4 or 5 months into this, it requires a bit more monitoring, not so much that people are getting their work done, but just more monitoring of the well-being of the employees.
Great points. Thank you, sir. Mr. Damsgaard, how about remote working in your opinion? What challenges do you see in working from home, and how does the industry manage it?
Yeah, so company margins, of course, have been under vicious attack, and every tool in the toolbox in order to recover, get back to profitability and sustainability is in play right now. And that also means that the road forward is going to be paved, unfortunately, with additional reductions. You know, and you're talking both on people, office space, travel and entertainment. We're seeing no travel right now. I think we can take some pages from some other industries, how they have been able to deal with it in the past. If you look at the capacity economy, the office space that is not necessary now, can we start using more of the office suites and WeWorks, you know, things of that nature as well too. While we talked about data analytics before, Sean briefly touched on in his introduction. Data analytics in a trade context is definitely moving forward. However, organizational performance analytics and visualizing the life cycle from our service lead generation until the cash generation is absent in many cases. And we need more granular team performance metrics so we can manage these virtual teams, show how we integrate across the different verticals within the organization, and ensure that service delivery is also met, and that we performance manage the team members so we can identify also what are their improvement opportunities, so continuing to develop our teams. That said, you know, creating these dashboards on the performance side of things, probably one of my biggest concerns with these remote workplaces or virtual teams is the obstacle that it presents in strengthening our unique company cultures. Again, without the usual connective tissue we have between people, there is actually a risk that subcultures could start forming within our organizations for our remote and also home-based teams. And I see going forward strategically that HR and communication functions is going to end up being critical success factors in order to manage, measure, and direct these virtual teams, and making sure we don't end up with these subcultures that then would reflect poorly towards our service delivery.
Thank you so much. And again, we're running out of time, so I'm going to be a little faster now. Mrs. Strobridge, we spoke about automation, and I know that your board has the new pipeline project. You have a lot of exciting projects, actually. Would you like to tell us a little bit about, you know, automation and your board, the pipeline projects in process?
Well, certainly I can love to highlight the infrastructure investments that we continue to make. I do want to just add one point to what Thomas and John have said about the human factor. As a manager, my style has always been managed by walking around. It's difficult to see the world from behind a desk. And so ensuring that I can spend time with our employees at all levels of the organization to hear what they have to say, to gain ideas, certainly from our frontline workers, all of which are considered essential employees, as ports are considered critical infrastructure. But you know, more and more as managers, we have to ensure that we've got a high emotional intelligence. So our EQ is certainly something that we are in tune with. And what's difficult, and I think for me in my 30 years, it is most difficult to feel connected to an organization when I am dealing with them remotely. You know, you have meetings, when it used to be when we would have meetings, there would be a pre-meeting chit chat, perhaps a little gossip, how's everything going with the family. After the meeting, perhaps a little after meeting chit chat. Here, when we're in these virtual meetings, once the meetings are done and you click leave meeting, you lose that. So there is a human element that is certainly taxing on us as managers and on the organization at large, because at the end of the day, people do business with people.
Yeah.
And I think that's really going to be one of the largest challenges, is how do we adjust our EQ, or perhaps develop it. The other thing that I've noticed is folks that are in a real world setting, there are certainly cues, nonverbal cues that you can pick up on that are very difficult to pick up on in a virtual environment. But I've also noticed that somebody who may be shy in a physical setting, in a virtual setting, they're much more animated, they're much more comfortable. So we're able to identify folks that actually are blossoming in this type of environment that may not. That's, as a manager, something that I think is we have to really be in tune to and acutely hone our own skills to recognize that. As it relates to what we're doing, look, the underlying precepts for investment in infrastructure, which is what port authorities do. We are primarily land developers, landlords, stewards of land, and at the end of the day, we still will see a measure of globalization, although we are transitioning. We've done a lot of business with China over the last 30 years, but we are certainly at a very interesting time in the historical relationship between the United States and China. And so to the point of reshoring, as John said, we're certainly going to be seeing, we think, more of that because of the cultural divide that we're seeing now and the political divide that we're seeing now between the two nations, which certainly, as Sun Tzu said from The Art of War, out of chaos comes opportunity. We will certainly see more opportunities in that regard.
I like that. Thank you. And again, we're running out of time, so we have our last set of questions because our viewers, our audience is actually sending some new questions. So let's be a little faster. Mr. Damsgaard, what different skill set is required for the future? For example, dealing with data, special needs, and so on.
Okay, thank you. Well, there can be no doubt that the skill sets to thrive in an online environment, virtual digital workplace are required. And I know there's already been some anecdotal evidence that adaptability by some generational divides have challenged effectiveness. So in that sense, what I would say is, work attitude will definitely have to change. Either you're the solution or you're the problem, and it's really that simple. And it's becoming a lot more visual when things get condensed in this virtual environment. In a conversation I had with Korn Ferry a few weeks back, they are very much finding out that executive teams are required to think in new creative ways, reimagining maritime and also being able to adapt faster. So not everybody has these required tools and skill sets, nor willingness to step into this uncharted territory. But this is a skill set that is going to be required going forward. That also sets up the premise that you need to have organizations that are built to change. You need to have a level of trust where it is okay for people to try out things and fail, as long as they just fail fast, fix it so we can move on. So that's a little bit more about the organizational opportunities there as well too. We talk about new opportunities of differentiation for organizations as well too, finding new areas where we can create value, and that requires a deeper understanding of the whole supply chain. And while maritime has been very focused on port A to port B, our little niche of the market, we actually need to have a much deeper understanding of how the entire supply chain works. And our clients are not necessarily the ones that are just paying the freight. It is actually our clients' clients. We need to make sure that it's set up for success. So skill sets that reach deeper into the value chain, the supply chain, is going to be critically important as well too.
Thank you. Gentlemen, just because we have a lot of questions from the audience as well, if you don't mind, what we're going to do is I'm going to start with a Q&A from the audience, and then I'm going to ask each one of you in the end to just give your feedback, like your final highlighted moment of what you think, what's your takeout, after this brilliant conversation. So we have Ms. Nicole Sherwood asking regarding collaboration, how concerned should we be of antitrust issues, especially within the EU? Who would like to answer that?
I'll take a shot at that. I think as long as you do things properly and keep in mind in the back of your head to be careful around antitrust, you know, we've got industry associations around the world. We've got some lawyer members. We're pretty careful about what we do, whether it's, you know, maritime industry associations, you know, you see the blockchain initiatives with multiple companies, certainly port associations. You've just got to be cognizant of that. I've worked on some projects and we've had lawyers talk to us and say, it is possible, you know, you just got to be careful. I think so. I don't see collaborating to improve the business environment and to make things more efficient. I think we can do that and keep in mind antitrust issues. I guess, Thomas, you probably think the same.
Yeah, so again, looking a little bit to a couple of different industries. If you look to oil and gas, and I just learned actually as late as last night, also the healthcare industry is starting to move into these data lakes where you're collaborating in the oil and gas segment, an initiative that is headed up by Shell, but have about 150 collaborators on it, where they're actually sharing each other's data information into these data lakes, and basis that then they use to overlay it with artificial intelligence in order to come up with smarter solutions. Needless to say, for publicly traded companies, they are proprietary information. So like John is saying, you just got to be careful and you got to vet what kind of information is shared, right? What can be shared? What is a competitive differentiator for a company, and what is more generic of nature. But it's, again, if IT industry has been dealing with open platform development for more than a decade. And that has brought us to where we are with IT.
Actually, we have more questions coming up, and they're exactly on that one. So let me, if you don't mind, have the next question. With a more exiled workforce, how should we handling cybersecurity in a productive and reactive measure? Cybersecurity, and again, it's trust and many other issues as well. Confidentiality of companies.
Well, any kind of security, you know, it's, and especially for maritime, it is not just our problem, it is the whole supply chain's problem, right? So it takes collaboration across clients, across platforms. And this is, again, where we got to rely on partners, solution partners as well, too.
Yeah. Next question. Will recruitment of new employees in the project cargo industry or any other industry be encouraged during post-COVID-19? So what are your thoughts, gentlemen?
Well, from a port perspective, ports are relatively resilient economically. I don't want to say they're full recession proof, but it's certainly, when you look at valuations or devaluations of currency, that creates ebbs and flows in imports and exports of goods. Goods movements may shift. And so there's certainly a resiliency in the port and the maritime space. It's the only way to move goods. I mean, 90+% of goods movement is surface transportation and it's maritime transportation globally. So there is a fairly economic resiliency. At the same time, certainly in the United States, we have an aging demographic. So there will create more opportunities for a younger workforce. We're already seeing that as the baby boomer generation enters retirement. The challenge is really promoting the industry to tomorrow's leaders today and investing in them today, because believe it or not, the maritime industry is still a relatively unknown industry to Main Street America and to folks at large. And so I think the industry needs to do a better job of promoting the virtues of the industry to the next generation.
Thank you, sir. That was a great question from my former student, Mr. Itoro Ibanga. And we move on to our next question by Mr. John Hoss. I've noticed that some of you are experiencing, let's see. Well, some choppy signals. I think this is an indicator that businesses will have to divert resources from physical office space to stronger internet support. Okay, so perhaps, you know, how should ports be looking at this regard, and how large companies should be looking at this, like larger, or more robust internet support? That's a great point. Actually, I had to come to the main campus for this event. Anybody would like to answer this question?
Well, I can try and take a stab at it here. And this is about, it's both IT infrastructure, but it's our infrastructure as a whole. Like I said, we have a capacity economy that is years ahead of where our industry is. We're still very much focused on brick and mortar and our fixed assets. As we are moving forward, and what is happening right now that is being accelerated, we are moving into environments, like I mentioned, the WeWorks, the Regus office setups, where you will be able to start pooling tools, pooling resources with other organizations as well too. And through that, you will be able to capture more. If it's in case of web access, more bandwidth, you will have shared resources as well too. We did this shift, started this shift in Inkscape already last fall, not knowing what was coming this year, where we started moving away from brick and mortar. And the interesting thing is, once you start getting on these agile platforms, you are able to start moving a lot more nimble. So now when there's not even a necessity to have a Regus set up because people are working from home, short-term contracts actually means that we can reduce cost a lot faster as well too. So I think it's about building agility. And then to the specific question about bandwidth and stuff like that, internet access, it's about having shared resources with other organizations. Yeah.
And the last question, and another question by Miss Alexandria Sadfin. What are some of your visions for the future in relation to this shift of inventory practices within our current supply chain? And gentlemen, please be a little more concise so that we have another question to answer. So the future inventory practices.
I'll take a stab at that. I think that goes sort of towards the nearshoring. I think people want to keep their inventories thin. If you want to keep it thin, you've got to have a robust supply chain that can fill those needs. And obviously what we have found was these longer supply chains are inherently risky. And if we want to continue with this model of getting things quickly and keeping inventories thin, then that's why I said earlier, I think nearshoring is definitely going to get some steam.
Great points. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And now we are running out of time. Do you have a sentence, each one of you, something that you want us to remember, like the conclusive comment for each one of you about the future, about your company, the trends? So let's start.
I'll go first.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got a quote from Warren Bennis, who wrote On Becoming a Leader, that I think is very appropriate as we go forward. He said, "We still tend to think of leaders like artists as solitary geniuses. In fact, the days when a single individual, however gifted, can solve our problems are long gone. The problems we face today come at us so fast and are so complex that we need groups of talented people to tackle them, led by gifted leaders or even teams of leaders." So that's how I'll finish this out. And I think that sort of sums up, a lot of what we've talked about, including with the hiring of people into the industry.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Next, Mr. Strawbridge.
Yes, well, I couldn't agree more with what John just said about building teams. At the end of the day, your organization, your industry, the economy, we all have to work towards resiliency. And that starts with a preparedness. Preparedness is the before, resiliency is during, recovery or business continuity is after. And whether it's a global pandemic, or in the case of the Port of Corpus Christi, we just went through a Category 1 hurricane, the first to hit the United States this season, this past Friday and Saturday. We were only shut down for 48 hours. Shows our resiliency. We had a Category 4 hurricane 3 years ago with Hurricane Harvey. We were shut down for 6 days after a Category 4 hurricane. At the end of the day, we have a really, really solid team. I call it the varsity team, who, no matter what the issue is that's brought to us, that is brought before us, we are prepared for it. Some of the things that we didn't think about, we're prepared for. But it all comes with a team of leaders, as John said, and the more that you prepare and the more that you really support your team and ensure that the team has all the resources that you can bring to bear, and then get out of their way and let them do the job that they've been hired to do. That's really where we get our resiliency, and we're certainly proud of the work that we've done in Corpus Christi, and we do a lot of benchmarking with other ports around the country and around the world. Port of Rotterdam was mentioned by Thomas. We're actually working with the Port of Rotterdam. If we're the pitcher for what we're sending out in energy for the EU, the Port of Rotterdam is the largest catcher. So we are working closely with them, as we are with other ports around the world, to increase that resiliency on both sides of the trade equation.
Excellent point. Thank you. And Mr. Damsgaard, Thomas?
Yeah, I think the threat that is going through this situation we're in right now is really the human factors. And all the people that are around. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. I mentioned the culture aspect earlier, and I think that is one of my biggest concerns, is this slide of culture and companies failing, their value propositions failing if they don't get that right. I think it was Maya Angelou that said, you know, they will not remember what they did for you, but they will remember how you made them feel.
How you made them feel.
Right, exactly. And I think it's really important as we are moving forward and we are grasping for our value proposition and how we can retain our relationships up and down the supply chain, not just with clients, but it's all our stakeholders that are important, that we keep that human factor aspect front and center. We're dealing with a lot of dead assets, and by that I mean, you know, just the steel by itself is dumb in many ways, right? It's how we utilize these assets, and this is where our people, they come in. And just to close out with one last quote there, I think it was Peter Drucker that said that strategy, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And it is really about these culture drivers that we need to keep in mind, and we take care of our people, they will take care of us. And yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'd like to thank our panelists and our audience for these great questions and great answers. So Mr. Simon and Kyle, would you like to wrap up this great event?
Thank you, Maria. Thanks to Sean, John, and Thomas as well. It's been a really interesting discussion, very, very relevant. I think it's the most prepared webinar we've run so far, so thank you for coordinating all that, Maria. As I said, we're going to send out the webinar later today, so you'll be able to view the recording. Our next webinar will be on the 13th of August, and it's going to be looking at autonomous surface vessels, so that's going to be really interesting, and we'll send out an invitation on that shortly, so keep an eye out for that. And yeah, we're going to be running the monthly leading up to our big Port of the Future conference in March. So there on your screen you can see the details on that, and a couple of other conferences that we're running that are of relevance. So thank you, everyone, and thank you for sticking with us. We only ran 10 minutes over time, so not bad, all things considered. And hope everybody, hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.